Another thing that affects justice is data. We're increasingly automated our processes and delegating decision making to machines. But since these are all designed by humans, there are some hidden assumptions that affect the results. Roel, how do you see this show up?
Yeah, so when we think about biases in data and algorithms and the applications, it's important to understand sort of three types of bias. One is first is the bias that's already there, pre-existing biases, and they're everywhere because people are biased, societies are biased. So if we collect data, especially social demographic data, there will always be biases in the data. And they might translate into how you build a decision-making tool or a control system. Then there is the technical biases, which have more to do with the types of assumptions that we're making as engineers and designers when we are putting together a system. And so here we might be, for instance, overlooking particular types of people in the grid. We saw in one of the earlier videos that we were overlooking solar farm over a wind farm or vice versa. And then there's a third type of bias, which is called emergent bias, which is more about the kinds of effects that we haven't anticipated and that emerge when we start to depend more and more on technologies like data and algorithmic technologies, data-driven and algorithmic technologies. And especially with generative AI, because these systems become so more and more complex, and we see these tools now being implemented, for instance, in how we are, or at least piloted in how we are facilitating new connections to the grid, so finding space in the grid and seeing how we can connect households. And we're using language models for that. And nobody really understands how these models work, right? So there's lots of biases sort of baked into the models, but there's even more that can come out when people start to work with them without really understanding how they work. So pre-existing bias, technical bias, and emergent bias basically means saying that we need to look at this much more throughout the life cycle of new technologies and our dependency on it, which is growing, of course, because we really need automation technologies in the energy transition.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think a related point, maybe it's a kind of a technical bias or an emerging bias. What I see in my research and work is that energy system is primarily relying on what we call big data of energy consumption, looking into the scales of buildings, regions, neighborhoods, cities, or country, collecting a lot of data about energy consumption, production, distribution, and taking decision based on that, which is fine. But at the same time, what we see is this type of big data misses on the lived experience of people related to energy. What are the different meanings of energy? And sometimes, if we only look at big data, we do not understand fully how people engage, what the challenges are, where some injustices may be cropping up. To give a concrete example, in 2022 winter, when gas prices really went up, in Amsterdam, we were doing research on a different topic, but we encountered, we were working in a region where people were suffering from energy poverty. And we realized and we got to know that a lot of people in the winter are simply turning off their heating because they cannot pay. So if you're just collecting big data of energy consumption, you will see how much this household or this neighborhood is paying for energy, how much energy they are consuming, and you would not sense that people during that period were really suffering from. They really suffered through the winters, living with the coldness, and they will deliberately do that. So the important point is we have to get understanding of the lived experience and the meanings of energy, and for that what we call in anthropology thick data is needed. The lived experience, the diverse meanings of how people relate to, engage, how with energy systems, and take that into account, because that will reveal different challenges and emerging justices or injustices which the system should be giving attention to.
And I would love to add to this that indeed, from a design perspective, looking at big data, the challenge is how we motivate and how we create platforms where people can actually share this data and become available for policymakers and to keep even negotiating possible biases around this data. And here there is a concept that we're also studying on energy data justice. So justice also on the data that is being shared, that is being collected, so we can engage more this activity and these practices for the benefit of the owners of the data. There's interesting principles there as well to look into, which is data legibility, so how people understand the data that they've been sharing and also that they've been taking back as a response. Data agency, and one very important, I think, for the concept of biases is the data negotiability. So how can we actually correct even the data that has been initially be shared and connect to other sources of data, more thick data and objective data. So these are super interesting developments in order to start thinking of how thick data and big data could actually be part of policy making.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly add to, I feel that at some level we are collecting data from the above, really like a bird, looking into what is happening. But then we also have to collect data as a snail on the ground, looking up, looking very close to where we are. And probably that's what we are needed. Right now, the system is looking from the top and not really looking from the bottom and bottom up. And that's probably will make many of these biases, which Roel is talking about, many of these possibilities to be taken into account in addressing justice in energy systems.
Yeah, and absolutely 100% agree. And we see these, I mentioned I work across different sectors and domains in society and looking at data and algorithmic systems, looking at questions of fairness, justice, safety. And we see the same sort of need for sort of combining or at least complementing the more top-down version, which often leads to all kinds of justice concerns if we're not careful, with more bottom-up and more participatory and justice-oriented approaches. In Delft, I think we bring a lot of interdisciplinary perspectives on data justice, algorithmic justice, whether it's socio-technical systems, design anthropology, design engineering, the list goes on, philosophy and ethics. So it's also a great place for these kinds of concerns and to also learn about these problems across different domains. And oftentimes these problems are connected because the people that are experiencing issues of energy justice might be the same groups, unfortunately, often that are experiencing algorithmic justice concerns, for instance, in the social welfare system, as we've seen many times.
Yeah, very interesting perspective. So data and algorithms do not have to make the energy system less just. If we enrich technical data with also the lived experience, and if we also make data more transparent and participatory, these can really become tools to make better decisions and more just decisions in the end. So thank you for watching and see you in the next video.